While our panelists get ready, I'd like to first thank Michèle Flournoy and Representative Thornberry for being here with us today, and of course Valerie as well. Wonderful job. Ruth, you can come on stage. Here's perfect. If you want to stay engaged with our work with Third Way's national security team, you can tweet us at ThirdWayNatSec. If you are interested in some of the research and the projects that we're doing on the national security team that Michèle and Representative Thornberry mentioned, including our recent strategy report to launch this event, you can find us at www.thirdway.org/issue/national security. Again, that's www.thirdway.org/issue/national security. My name is Jason Browder. As Valerie had mentioned, I am the Senior Policy Advisor for National Security at Third Way, and I help to lead the U.S.-China Digital World Order Program. I'm a former Hill staffer. I was the National Security Advisor to Congressman Beto O'Rourke, former Fulbright Presidential Management Fellow in the Office of Management and Budget, the National Security Division, and most recently I was the Assistant Dean at New York University, Abu Dhabi. We're honored for you all to be here, particularly those who are online, and to host these incredible national security leaders and women leaders. Diversity of thought is extremely important to us. Empowering women is extremely important to us, and as you can tell by the individuals that we had fireside chat and the panel itself. That would include Deputy Assistant Secretary Ruth E, Third Way's very own former Senior Vice President for National Security, Mieke Eoyang, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber, and then a dear friend and former colleague, Carole House, who is the current Director for Cyber and Digital at the National Security Council at the White House. So let's just jump in. So to begin, we really need to appreciate the macro environment to understand China, its strategy for digital authoritarianism. And we unfortunately can't do that without first discussing China's positioning and strategy since the catastrophic and unprovoked war between Russia and Ukraine. I'm going to start off with Mieke. If you put your DoD hat on, if you can paint a picture for our audience for what Russia's invasion of Ukraine has on the appeal of China and its authoritarianism, and if there are any specific examples, whether that's maybe Taiwan or specific capabilities. And then Ruth, if you would follow up and maybe add some context, specifically China's digital authoritarianism strategy from where you sit with the new Digital and Cyber Bureau at State Department.
Yeah. Thanks so much for that. And it's great to be back here at Third Way and to see everyone again. And I really appreciate this effort because I do think that this is the core challenge for the United States in the coming decades and probably for the remainder of our lives. In the new National Defense Strategy, we talk about China as the pacing threat, and we very much recognize that the competition and tensions between the U.S. and China will define U.S. national security policy for quite some time to come. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine is tremendously important for what China is going to do on the world stage. Whether or not a country succeeds in changing self-governance by force, or whether or not they pay an unacceptable price for trying to do so, is a core question in China's calculus. If Russia is able to take Ukraine, and not pay a significant price for that, that emboldens other countries who think that they might be able to do the same. And we see in this Russia attempt to try and take Ukraine, the reaction of the world, and the just strong response from countries around the world who have no direct security stake in the situation, but are willing to impose costs on Russia to show how unacceptable it is, all the way around the world, right, from countries in NATO all the way to Japan. And so we see that change in export controls, in sanctions, in assistance to Ukraine, that around the world people really recoil at the idea of trying to forcibly change the self-governance of a people. The lessons that we see in this Russia-Ukraine conflict and what Russia is trying to do to Ukraine, the cyber dimensions of that are incredibly important to us, especially in the Defense Department, to understand what the playbook might be if another cyber-capable country were to attempt to do this. And some of the things that we see, some of which has been reported publicly, may form parts of China's playbook and are really important for us to understand. The ways that the Russians try to kick Ukraine, or make Ukraine go dark with the Viasat disruption, with much of the malware that was occurring across Ukraine, attempts to try and disrupt basic government function. And the U.S. is working very hard to try and help Ukraine preserve not only its physical security, but it's also its digital security. Attempts, and this was reported recently, by Russia within occupied territories in Ukraine to force traffic back through Russian networks, where it will be subject to the kind of filtering and censorship that the Russian people experience day to day. The challenges that the technology industry has, both in Russia and Ukraine, in terms of what the effect is of the workforce on trying to flee from conflict or trying to leave the country in objection taking place, and then the export controls and the long-term impact that that has on Russia. These are all factors that need to go into our calculus, but at the same time, I'm sort of hesitant to draw too many conclusions here because this is a conflict that is still ongoing. We don't know what the end stage will be yet, so it's a little bit hard to draw total lessons learned because something could happen today, tomorrow, in the weeks to come that may make us rethink how influential this is. And as we learn lessons, as the Chinese look at this to learn lessons, I think things will change, may change further as this conflict unfolds.
Thank you. I think China's efforts in the international stage when it comes to exporting digital authoritarianism is a huge concern. And I can talk a little bit about sort of what they're doing, but also more importantly, what this administration is doing about it. But first, I want to say that technology competition, I think, is one of the defining foreign policy challenges for the coming decades. But we are not at competition with the Chinese people, and it's really important that we're clear about the fact that this is related to the Chinese Communist Party and their actions and activities that are authoritarian or oppressive, and not just what they're doing around the world, but what they're doing at home to censor and oppress the Chinese people. And so I just want to make sure that that's really clear as we go into this discussion. Through the digital Silk Road, China is seeking to export, digital connectivity around the world, but with it, some of the really digital authoritarianism as well. And so thinking about a lot of the things that the previous panelists touched on, which is how do we have a plan to help combat that and offer democratic choices to our partners and allies. And I think there's a few areas that we're really focused on. One is partnership. We're working very closely with like-minded partners around the world to promote a positive vision for the future of the internet. And you see that with the U.S.-EU Trade and Technology Council, with work in the Quad, which is the U.S., India, Japan, Australia, and a lot of work in standards bodies. So we heard the previous panels talk about how China is working in international standard setting bodies to rewrite the rules of the road for the future of the internet. That's something that we're working very closely together with our partners. Another effort I'll mention is the Declaration for the Future of the Internet, which was launched with nearly 60 countries who reaffirmed and recommitted themselves to an open, interoperable, reliable, and secure internet, and one that is also continues to be governed by multi-stakeholder approaches that include industry, civil society, the private sector. I think one thing we also see the PRC do is try to bring technical controls of the internet into multilateral forums that are government-driven rather than multi-stakeholder. And so that's another area where we're working very closely with our partners and allies. The International Telecommunication Union has its plenipotentiary conference in a few months. They will elect a new Secretary General, and the United States is very pleased to support Doreen Bogdan-Martin as the candidacy for that. And I think that's critical to ensuring that the ITU continues to deliver on its core mandate for countries around the world, but doesn't sort of stray into other areas or become a battleground for some of these more authoritarian efforts. And then the last thing I'll mention, and happy to get into more detail on any of these things, is the Digital Connectivity and Cybersecurity Partnership, which was launched in 2018. And that's really a whole of government effort that the U.S. government is doing, is to offer alternatives to secure and reliable connectivity around the world, both in terms of our financing and export credit tools, but also training and capacity building to help create an enabling environment that supports a vibrant digital economy, but one that is in line with and respects for human rights. And so there's a lot that the United States is doing in close cooperation with its partners and allies to really offer these positive visions, and I think that these efforts need to continue.
And we're definitely going to get into some of this partner building. I want to dive a little deeper into China's strategy response post the Ukraine-Russian war. And this would be to you, Carole. Banyalin, who's the Senior Fellow of Asian Security Studies at CSIS, testified in Congress recently about the Ukraine crisis strengthened China's desire to be more self-reliant. This is specifically on manufacturing and technology, more resilient industrial supply chains, and pushing for chip production, self-sufficiency, and more investment in key strategic sectors such as artificial intelligence. And I'm curious, Carole, working at the NSC, do you agree with this assessment? And if so, what is the United States strategy to compete?
Great. Well, first, just wanted to state how much, what a joy it is to be up here working alongside two powerhouses that have been leading a lot of our digital policy efforts, and Ruth, whom I worked with at the NSC, driving a lot of the efforts that she just spoke to. So I just wanted to give her a shout out for that. But well, first, continue to reinforce Mieke's comments about the kinds of potential lessons that we can see from Putin's and Russia's continued invasion into Ukraine, the devastating consequences that are being wrought there, but then also the consequences that the international community is coming together to impose upon Russia, and specifically the regime and those who have propped up this kind of destabilizing activity and continued invasion of Ukraine's sovereignty. So I think that there's nothing more that I can really add there, because Mieke covered it really holistically. But I mean, we have been imposing these consequences on Russia for good reason, and we are cutting them off from access to innovative technologies, and imposing these financial consequences because of the decisions that have been made to violate their sovereignty, and the kinds of principles that really underlie the United Nations, and just responsible behavior on the international stage. However, because of that, understood that other nations may potentially see that if the rest of the world, like-minded nations, those that are committed to respecting sovereignty, to respecting democracy, may come together and be able to impose really devastating consequences on malicious actors, then there may be lessons that they're trying to glean from that and figure out how to be more self-sufficient. But I will say that we're not trying to cut off China from the international stage. We're simply trying to pursue the strategy that we put forward in Secretary Blinken's speech recently, that really underscored that our approach with China, our strategic framework, is one focused on investment and alignment, as well as posturing to compete. So ultimately, I think that that's where you're going to continue to see our efforts. It's focusing on how to invest in our own capabilities. The president signed into law the most significant investment in infrastructure in history last year. We're going to continue to invest in critical and emerging technologies that will better enable our ability to compete with China and others, But we're going to have to continue to, I think Secretary Blinken said, deal with each other for the time being. So I think that's right. But we're going to continue to invest in our own innovative technologies and our own workforce. We're also going to align with international partners. A lot of the partnerships that we've announced, like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, that allow for us to work with like-minded partners to enable a resilient economy, a clean economy, a connected one, and a fair one that also combats issues like corruption. So I think the United States approach is going to continue to invest in our partnerships, like what Ruth spoke to, and work to make sure that we are working with our partners to invest in the kinds of capabilities that will ensure that we stay at the forefront on the digital stage.
So there's a general consensus among practitioners that China's digital mastery effectively has harmed democracy overall, particularly its exportation of digital authoritarianism. The German Marshall Fund released a report last week that said the Chinese government is deploying a digital technology combination of governance standards, hardware, software, and protocols to suppress liberal democracy. We've heard from Michèle earlier, and you mentioned it as well, sort of setting these standards. So for you, Ruth, what are the important steps that the United States and its allies and partners can take to shape digital standards in prominent standard-setting bodies?
Thank you. It's a good question, and it's one that this administration has spent a lot of time thinking about, and is a focus of a lot of the conversations with our partners and allies. So in the U.S. and EU Trade and Technology Council, there's an entire working group devoted to closer cooperation on standards bodies, including the establishment of sort of an early warning system where if there are particular proposals or elections or other activities that are taking place in some of these technical standards bodies, that there's sort of a system in place for these very technical practitioners within governments to talk to each other and alert to each other. I think it's really important maintaining the voluntary, private sector-driven, consensus-based nature of standards bodies where the best proposals win based on their technical merits. And so when we think about how do we ensure that the U.S. and others lead in those bodies, it really comes down to research and development so that we do have the best proposals to put forward in these standards bodies. I think avoiding efforts to bring technical protocols of the internet into multinational bodies such as the UN or the ITU is another area. So China's pushed multiple times this idea of new IP at the ITU and other fora, but the US and like-minded partners have been successful in pushing back on those efforts and ensuring that it continues to remain in sort of ICANN and other multi-stakeholder bodies that include the private sector and others. I think bringing countries on board who are either emerging markets is really important as well. I think having the G7, the US and Europe sort of writing the rules of the road for the 21st century comes at our peril. And I think creating a more inclusive and democratic processes that bring in emerging countries who will have incredible innovation over the coming decades and be the users and deployers of so much of this emerging technology is also really important. And so I think that's another important area of focus for the United States as we think about how do we engage with our partners and allies on a positive vision for the future of the internet in the coming decades.
Yeah, if it's okay for me to chime in, just another area, because the issue of standards are so important. Of course, all the forums that Ruth spoke to are just critical, but I have to talk about the digital asset work that the administration is driving well, and why the components that we're looking at under the international engagement framework and the competitiveness strategy and trying to drive standards there, I think are going to be so important. So digital assets, the market has significantly grown, also shrunk a bit of late, but the president recognizes that digital asset technologies can be really transformational. There's significant risks in the space related to market protections, consumer protections, anti-money laundering, financial stability, There's also concerns around issues like state surveillance and integrating in the future of money or the future of these systems that allow for a commingling of the pipes that allow for information transfer and the future internet, along with the future of value transfer and the future financial system, the need for making sure that democratic principles are being built into digital assets and underlying distributed ledger technology infrastructure. So with all of that, after the issuance of the executive order from President Biden in early March on ensuring responsible development of digital assets, there's a lot of efforts right now underway by the administration to put together an international engagement framework, which includes requirements for agencies to identify the international forum where we need to be prioritizing our engagement to drive the kinds of standards that will respect and reflect democratic principles, including things like countering, corruption and illicit finance, but also driving in issues like ensuring appropriate privacy while reflecting appropriate discoverability that should exist in the financial system. So there's lots of opportunities there to continue to drive standards, as well as look for partnerships on the international stage to look at where we need to be working together to shape what the future of money looks like and explore these opportunities for cross-border payments.
Great answers. I could go many ways with this, but in particular, a topic that's garnered a lot of attention is sort of this U.S.-China decoupling. So you can talk about that in the digital asset space, on what China did with miners or the CDDC, the digital yuan. And there's, I think, a divergent of approaches as well to the decoupling. There's John Bateman, who's a senior fellow at Carnegie Endowment, argues sort of against the defensive approach that Trump administration foreign policies had. And recently a Washington Post editorial actually argues for them, in particular Hikvision, and sanctioning them. So this is for the group. What is the strategy around China and the U.S. decoupling? More specifically, does the Biden administration continue to support more defensive foreign policy strategies, whether that's tariffs and sanctions on Chinese companies such as Huawei or as I mentioned, Hikvision? And if not, would you be able to expand?
Well, I'll just highlight, can't preview anything specific here other than the actions that we've already taken, but we'll continue to look at the appropriate controls that we need for our exports and the right policy measures that we need to put in place to protect American sensitive data, consistent with the executive order that the president signed last year. However, I think that the U.S. approach is really the one I know that I outlined before, one that's proactively seeking for opportunities to invest in our own technologies to ensure that we maintain and leverage the competitive advantages that the U.S. economy and the U.S. population and our democracy really enable us to uniquely leverage and drive. And you're seeing it in the investments that we're trying to drive in quantum computing, in artificial intelligence, in biotechnology. The critical emerging technologies list that the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and the National Security Technology Council published earlier this year, or I think it was last year, that pointed to critical technologies like financial technologies, including digital assets and digital identity infrastructure. All of these kinds of things are the sorts of technologies that we're going to continue to try to invest in, build our own capacity in, make sure that our markets maintain competitiveness, that we're leveraging the benefits of the U.S. workforce. We're making those investments in workforce, in jobs and training to make sure that we can stay at the forefront. But we will continue to align with our partners and then drive to compete with with Chinese markets, and of course continue to push our vision for a non-authoritarian future of the internet.
Yeah. I think one of the challenges is when we talk about these things, there's a sort of temptation to say that this is about a made in China label versus a made in U.S. label. And it really is about the difference in technology approaches and what that means for us from a security perspective. Right? When Chinese technology products have hard-coded into them censorship filters, right? So that if you buy a phone, and I was just in Lithuania where our colleagues there had gone through and done the technical analysis to show that in Chinese devices, they had found censorship technology embedded in them, so that it's not just if you buy the device, it's just like made in the US versus made in China. It is exporting a certain kind of repression with the device, which is an external expansion of their own internal need to control the population, what the population says and thinks. If it were not that kind of a technology, if it were sort of a level playing field on that, it would be different. If the technology, if the data were on Americans were not being sent back to China. From the Defense Department perspective, this becomes a national security risk where the data of US government personnel, if it's being sent back to China, is a challenge. If our allies are adopting Chinese network technology, it puts a lid on how much cooperation we can have with them and how much information we can share with them because of our concerns about visibility onto the networks. This is not just about labels of one country versus another. It is about the kind of technology that we're talking about here that poses a security risk to the United States.
In continuation on the topic of decoupling, Scott Malcolmson, the author of the book Splinternet, argues that the Internet of the future will be an Internet of balkanization. You can see this with Chinese government erected the Great Firewall for political reasons. The Russian government has enacted a sovereign internet law that allows it to partition itself from the rest of the internet. The U.S. and its partners have also discussed plans to create similar firewalls. This would be to, block child pornography or weapon-making instructions. Ruth, and then maybe Carole after that. In regards to the balkanization and U.S. companies working abroad, can the U.S. Counter China throwing its weight to make American companies self-censor? And two, are we able to push back on China's ability to basically coerce U.S. companies into tailoring speech or curtailing speech to the ideology and imperatives of the CCP?
Sure. Well, first, I don't know that I would say that our policy is one of decoupling with China. China is integral to the global economy and to our ability to solve challenges from climate to COVID to the opioid crisis. And so the United States and China will have to deal with each other for the foreseeable future. That being said, there are areas that are critical to U.S. national and economic security where the United States will work with its partners and allies to do what we have to do to protect ourselves. And so I think it really falls into this idea of both a protect and a promote strategy. And so I talked when I opened about some of the things we're doing to promote a positive vision, to cooperate with our partners and allies, but there's quite a lot that's being done on the protect side as well, whether it's export controls, protection for U.S. intellectual property, or supply chain security. How are we thinking about critical global supply chains? When it comes to this idea of the balkanization of the internet, the PRC absolutely uses economic coercion against global businesses and foreign governments alike to try to shift their behavior. And when the PRC threatens to block market access for American companies because what it says or does here at home, such as standing up for human rights, that's a clear distinction from the values that inform their relationships with the private sector versus the U.S. relationship with the private sector. And so we encourage all U.S. companies to remember their responsibility to respect human rights under the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and that this also applies to their public statements related to the PRC. I think in the balkanization of the internet and how we think about harmful content or illegal content online is a huge challenge, and one that democracies need to work together to figure out how to address. The United States and the 60 partners that signed the Declaration for the Future of the Internet all recommitted to a global, interoperable, reliable, and secure internet that enables citizens all over the world to communicate with each other, that embodies competition and connectivity, supports human rights. But the reality is this vision has been under attack, and China is building its own internet with a Great Firewall. So I think the way that we can best combat that is to continue to double down and ensure that partners around the world, governments, commit themselves to this vision and to taking actions that support it. And that includes, as I've mentioned several times, a commitment to the multi-stakeholder governance of the internet.
Yeah, not much more to add except just continuing to drive our work on the international stage, investment in the multi-stakeholder process, driving some of our investments like through the DCCP and the Digital Invest effort that I know U.S.A. announced $3 million, I think, earlier this year to be able to help accelerate $300 million in private capital, I think, to help drive secure network solutions around the world. I think that continuing to leverage those partnerships and that special relationship that the U.S. benefits from with our industry is really the way that we move forward. And since I'll tag back to something that Mieke really pointed out is continuing to expose where we see some of this malicious activity happening, where we see surveillance technology existing and then being exported globally, where we see malicious cyber activity like that we exposed in an unprecedented way with a huge group of partners last summer, and China's use of criminal contract hackers in order to conduct malicious cybercrime activity like ransomware. We'll just continue to maintain transparency and leverage our approach and the benefits of a democratic system and all of our like-minded partners to hold accountable these actors and continue to reinforce to American industry that we need to maintain our commitment to protecting human rights.
This will be the last question, so we'll have time to open it up for some Q&A. And this is basically how the administration would hope to engage with policy members. So a bipartisan set of House and Senate lawmakers are proposing a new compromise for government screening of American investments in China as part of a pending economic competitiveness bill. In your view, how has the administration or your office best engaged with policymakers to craft effective technology-focused competitiveness? And this could include cyber, data acquisition, sanctions, and/or policies that create an ecosystem here to really harness the incredible talent in the U.S.
Well, I'll start on competitiveness since I referenced the digital asset EO earlier, because right now the Department of Commerce, which also has a request for comment out right now, so I hope all of you will submit a comment, but they are developing the first ever competitiveness framework for the U.S. on digital assets and their underlying technologies. So, of course, more to follow on what that will actually include and look at, but competitiveness includes some of the protect but also promote elements, and a lot of that's going to be looking at what we need to do for investments and supporting research and development. So not just making sure that the agencies that have some of the powerhouse R&D authorities are actually pointed to the issue sets, but that they're also resourced to do so. So I know that there have been some bills that have been that have been proposed so far, and we continue to look forward to working with Congress to fully resource some of those efforts to make sure that we can properly invest. But I think looking at the policy issues, the key authorities that can have the highest impact on the most critical technology areas, since of course we're always going to be somewhat resource constrained. So we need to make sure that we're investing in the right workforce and talent, and also providing the right resources to be able to support grants, as well as in-house U.S. government R&D that can help to promote industry development. I'll turn it over to Mieke and Ruth.
I'll defer to Ruth on this one because I feel like the competitiveness stuff is less than.
Sure. I mean, I think there's a number of pieces of legislation that change names frequently. So whether it's the CHIPS Act, or formerly known as U.S.A, or the America Competes Act, all of those have really important funding to help as we think about sort of building this economic future for the United States where we are competitive in the technology space and leaders in the technology space. And so I think just one example I'll give is, there's funding in these proposed bills to support Open RAN, open radio access networks, research and development. And I think this touches back to something our previous panelists had said about the importance of offering alternatives to telecommunications companies such as Huawei and ZTE. And so right now, the market is dominated by traditional network vendors who offer sort of a closed stack. But with network virtualization and open radio access network architectures, you can build a lot more modularity into the networks, and there can be a lot more companies that compete by offering discrete pieces of it. And this really offers the opportunity to both drive down costs, but create a lot more innovation and competition in the telecommunications network infrastructure space, and therefore create a lot more resilience and security. And so, but this takes investments, and I think, CapEx investments in telecommunications networks are very high, spectrum is very high, and so a lot of telecommunications companies would welcome, including in the developing countries, the ability to deploy network infrastructure at a lower cost, but one that doesn't sacrifice their security. So I think that's just one important example. There's also funding in these bills for the State Department for foreign assistance to bolster our efforts on providing assistance on innovation and telecommunications security around the world. So I think funding is really important as we think about how we compete going forward.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on something that Ruth just said about assistance, because I think it is really important. We in the Defense Department are also thinking about how we leverage security cooperation tools to try and strengthen networks of partners and allies around the world. And one of the things that we've seen in the Ukraine crisis is that when they faced disruption, that they had a multitude of internet service providers on the ground, gave them a lot of redundancy and resilience in their network traffic. Having a more vibrant, robust, competitive technology space allows you to weather disruption a lot more easily. So how we think about doing some of those things, how we work together with the State Department to try and improve networks of partners and allies around the world, this is another thing where we can try and bring U.S. technology solutions to bear as we work to strengthen partners around the world.
Thank you. And with that, we'll open it up for a couple of questions.
Hi, yeah, I'm Gabe Royal. I'm a PhD student at GW studying digital asset public policy. My question is with regard to, we mentioned the digital yuan and their central bank digital currency and their penchant for economic coercion. My question is there a sense in your offices or government more generally that we need to be taking a more defensive or proactive approach to kind of this combination of the potential for highly surveillable, non-transparent currency and the potential that they could possibly coerce corporations that we do business with or are based out of the U.S. To put highly surveillable currency in the People's Bank of China's coffers? Or is it more, we just need to be focused on developing better options here at home? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I'll take that one, at least at first, and anyone else tag on. So first I'll highlight that because I've gotten this question before, that the digital asset EO that was issued was not done specifically in response or pointed to any particular nation or effort. Both Russia and China came up as questions, and it was a long ongoing effort that then led to launching of the EO. However, it's not done in a vacuum, and the U.S. government is very aware of and certainly noting and monitoring all the developments in central bank digital currencies, as well as private cryptocurrencies worldwide, and driving a multi-pronged approach on that front to be able to address some of the significant risks, but then also, like I mentioned, leverage the positive potential benefits, like reinforcing the U.S. role within the financial system, as well as driving U.S. competitiveness and driving the U.S. as a home for innovation in fintech and other emerging technologies. Related to the ECNY, China's central bank digital currency, CBDC, we would certainly note that given China's historical record for engaging in things like economic coercion, for privacy violations and human rights abuses, we would certainly advise anyone who's looking to leverage the ECNY or partner with them to consider the potential risks. And most importantly, on the promote side, look to principles like the G7 principles for retail CBDCs that the G7 issued that pointed to important fundamental principles like human rights, like maintaining privacy. So I think not able to preview any specific actions there, but I think that what we definitely need to pay attention to is working with other democracies and other like-minded nations to figure out what does the future of that money look like. The risks as well as the benefits of cryptocurrencies all really depend on the design. They can be incredibly transparent. They can also be incredibly obfuscated. Some of the key challenges with why crypto has enabled the rise of ransomware is because of insufficient identity being built into these ecosystems and insufficient regulatory controls like bolting identity on at the KYC level with these exchanges. So there's definitely ways to try to design a system that enables protection of privacy, also can enable lawful discoverability and due process and all the other kinds of factors that you want into an ecosystem. We believe that, hence why we're trying to drive competitiveness and responsible development of the technologies. So on the U.S. side, we certainly have not taken the approach that China did of prohibiting private cryptocurrency activity in the nation. We're instead trying to promote responsible development of it on the industry side, and then also have established with the utmost priority research and development into a U.S. option, a U.S. central bank digital currency. That continues to build on and reinforce efforts that have long been ongoing at the Federal Reserve. But now we're actually currently, the White House is leading an assessment on the technology needs and capacity needs for a U.S. CBDC. So I think that we're definitely going to continue to look at what we need to drive on the U.S. industry side for responsible innovation, on the U.S. government side to examine whether or not a U.S. CBDC is in the nation's interest, and then to determine what the right actions are from there.
Hi guys, my name is Travis Numhard. I work for DC government in a compliance space. I'm more of a defense enthusiast. So my question is, given China's economic and global prowess, heavily reliant on its population and the challenges that it's facing around its prior one-child policy, it has since expanded into the African continent, making inroads, economic investments, telecommunication investments, that sort of thing. What inroads or steps have we taken as a country to tap into the African continent for that kind of a national security consideration? I know we made many investments in Latin America, building relationships sort of thing, but we don't hear as much going on in the African continent as much, and so would love to hear your perspectives on that.
Sure. I mean, I think the African continent is an incredible source of innovation and economic growth for the coming century, and one that is a high priority to look at how we can partner with those countries for this administration. You know, there's a long-standing program on Power Africa that I think enables a lot of cooperation in the power sector. There's also Prosper Africa, which looks at how do we leverage the U.S. private sector to engage in helping build some of the development needs. And I would say that under this administration in particular, looking at Digital Africa and how do we work to help increase connectivity in countries in Africa is also a high priority. So I think there's a lot of work being done there. But, you know, we're never going to have the same model that China has where, you know, you have heavily subsidized equipment or industries that are essentially given away for free or through debt trap diplomacy. We are very focused on responsible and sustainable development and creating ecosystems that can sustain and take advantage of these advancements. And so sometimes it's not as fast or as visible as some of the Chinese investments, but you know, a lot of what we try to talk to countries about, particularly in the telecommunications space, is free isn't free. So what are you getting in what is the Chinese government or, you know, Huawei or these companies getting in exchange for this equipment that's so far below market rate? Like what drives that and what's behind it and what is being sacrificed in terms of security or sovereignty in that space? But it's certainly a very important area of focus.
Time for one more question.
Sean Lingus with CNN. Thanks for being here. Great discussion. I guess this is probably a question for Mieke and Ruth, but also Carole too, if she wants. The benefit of hindsight, looking back on what the U.S. government has done in support of Ukraine, cyber defenses in the months before the war and continuing through the present day. I know that you talked a bit about the successes. I'm wondering if you could put your self-critical caps on a little bit and talk about what, with the benefit of hindsight, you might have done differently to help Ukraine? Obviously, there's a number of fronts of assistance, incident response, analysis, Cyber Command's role. Is there anything that you would have done differently knowing what you know now?
Yeah, appreciate the question, because I think it's easier to point to things that one has done and talk about the impact that that's had than the challenge that we've had. And I think one of the biggest challenges that I see, not just with Ukraine, but with cyber across, as we build partners and allies more generally, is cyber is an area that's not just a defense priority. The previous panel talked about how it crosses silos, and this is one of those areas where, right, as we in the Defense Department seek to work with our counterparts in other countries, they may or may not have any responsibility for the networks inside their territories. And so for that, we have to work with the State Department, we have to work with U.S.A.I.D. to be able to understand how that comes together. Because cyber comes together in a whole of government way across agencies with all these different responsibilities, it makes it hard to have a single point of contact as to who to talk to and how we approach those things. And I think this is something that we're learning during the conflict, and I think it's a challenge. I think it's also a challenge because a lot of countries don't really understand what their cyber needs are. So they're not making the kind of clear and coherent asks of the U.S. government that really understand what they need and what their steps are in their development based on where they are. So I think this is an area where coordination across the government is something that will continue to improve as we go forward. But we're learning along the way.
And I think that's exactly right. And I think taking the sort of telecommunications and network infrastructure as sort of a case point, it's how do we surge to effectively keep the lights on, but to keep communication flowing when there is a conflict and networks may be taken down, or as in Europe, many telecommunications networks will have a parent a parent company headquartered somewhere else making a lot of network decisions with a subsidiary in a particular country. And so how do we work together to ensure that critical access to communication continues? I think thinking too about, the sort of the sanctions that the U.S. and then our allies imposed upon Russia for this unprovoked war of aggression, how can those occur in a way that also doesn't cut off the Russian people's access to information? And how do we sort of balance those two things are things that I think have also been really important and things that we've learned by doing in this process. And also thinking about, misinformation and harmful content online that's being spread that's either, causing harm to the people of Ukraine, or things related to the food insecurity being blamed on U.S. or like-minded sanctions when in fact, there are other supply chain issues. And so thinking about how do we as like-minded countries better address those sort of things in the future. So I think, as she said, this isn't over yet, but I think of course there's always a lot of opportunity for learning and reflecting on how things are handled in crisis in order to better understand how to respond in the future.
With that, I'd like to thank our incredible women and national security leaders for being here today. Thanks everyone who was able to join us in person and online. And with that, we'll conclude the event.